McCarthy without understanding the town that produced him, of which he was a part, literally and metaphorically, for his entire life. Now, Appleton, Wisconsin is a paper mill town of about 75,000 today, but only about 20,000 when McCarthy, who was born in 1908, grew up here in the 19 teens and 1920s. Appleton is located in northeast Wisconsin, about an hour and a half north of both Milwaukee and Madison, but worlds away from them politically, socially, and culturally. Appleton was and is a relatively conservative place. When Joe McCarthy was growing up here, it elected some Democrats, and indeed, McCarthy himself started out as a Democrat. But today, it is considered a red area, and I mean red in its contemporary usage, with nary a red communist in sight. Its congressman, state senator, and assembly representative, more often than not, is a Republican. Its residents are primarily Lutherans and Catholics of German, Dutch, and Irish descent. And McCarthy himself was a devout Catholic whose parents were both Irish. In Joe McCarthy's day, Appleton was a so-called sundown town where African Americans were prohibited from staying overnight, never mind residing permanently, which meant that until the 1960s, Appleton had an African American population of 0. And even today, the proportion of Black Appletonians hovers around 2%. Joe McCarthy's Appleton was a friendly, unpretentious place where family and community ties were powerful and enduring. Appleton had a strong sense of place. It's where people live their entire lives, and their children, and their children too. McCarthy was one of the comparatively few who got out and went somewhere else, but only when he was 38. Until then, except for college at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and McCarthy's father had warned him away from the University of Wisconsin in Madison as a haven for godless communists and steered Joe to a Catholic school instead, plus Joe's overseas service in the military during World War II. Except for that, McCarthy had spent his entire life in Appleton and the surrounding area until 1946, when he was 38. But along with its community and mutuality, there was a bounded and insular quality to Joe McCarthy's Appleton that he absorbed, a suspicion of the outside and of outsiders, of places like Madison and Milwaukee, and of farther away places like New York and Washington, and all that those places symbolized: unfamiliar people, faces, and ideas. That is the Appleton, Wisconsin that produced Joe McCarthy. And if you want to know and understand who he was and what he became, the place to start is the place that formed him, the paper mill town and agricultural hub on the back banks of the Fox River, safe, peaceful, and orderly, with its straight as strings streets, well-tended homes, and a fresh scrubbed, bustling main business drag, College Avenue, named, of course, for what became Lawrence University. That's the place that made Joe McCarthy, that gave him his vision and his values, and to which he always returned in life and finally in death. And so when we want to explain Joe McCarthy, Appleton is where we start. And I'll return to McCarthy's formative years later in this talk, but of course it is not where we end, because it is only after McCarthy left Appleton in 1947 to become United States Senator from Wisconsin that he became the consequential figure we recall today, one of the most consequential Americans of the 20th century, one of the most consequential world figures of the century, for that matter. And as proof of this, consider that Joe McCarthy was one of the very few individuals in that century to become an ism. In his case, McCarthyism. And being an ism in history is, of course, not usually an honor. Think about those after whom an ism is named. It is not a compliment. Examples abound. Stalinism, Maoism, Peronism, after the Argentinian authoritarian famously husband to Evita. Today, Trumpism, usually employed as an epithet. And so the use of an ism after one's name customarily implies controversy and negativity, but it also connotes an enduring legacy that survives death and lives on unto the generations. That is what Appleton's most famous native son has bequeathed to the nation and to the world. Whether he intended it or not, McCarthyism has come to mean suspicion, intolerance, innuendo, and fear. And lest we seek to comfort ourselves by viewing this as only a disease of the right in America, and of course, that is how it began, it is clear that McCarthyism is now an equal opportunity smear device, now used by both sides against perceived enemies in ways that would have been familiar to McCarthy himself. So McCarthyism has offered us very few heroes. Both right and left now seem to possess his self-righteousness, his disregard for nuance and context, his suspicion of the motives of the other side, his affinity for scapegoating, and his willingness, now exponentially more powerful and wide-reaching in an age of social media that fortunately McCarthy himself never lived to see, to hurl the most exaggerated and untruthful accusations at political opponents. And all in an environment that seems to regard the mere loss of an election, a single election cycle, as a cataclysmic event that foretells the end of democracy altogether. If you want to know where our present day culture of, if you disagree with me, your motives, your character, even your validity as a fellow human being are suspect, if you want to know where that came from, you can look to McCarthy and McCarthyism. If you want to know where the idea of fake news comes from, look again to McCarthy and McCarthyism. If you want to know where hateful Twitter mobs and cancel culture come from, look to McCarthy and his ism. So much of the poisoned political atmosphere in the country today, the likes of which I have never seen, and I've been observing, thinking about, and writing about American politics, if you put it all together, for about a half a century now, can be traced to the morally and ethically compromised Pandora's box that Joe McCarthy opened during the comparatively short but deadly time during which he was at the height of his power and influence, roughly 1950 to 1954. McCarthyism is America's saddest and most destructive ism, and it seems to have entered and infected our country's bloodstream in permanent ways. But having said all this, McCarthy's story is more complicated than a simple morality play, with good people arrayed on one side and bad on the other. The reasons it is complicated are twofold, I think. The first reason is the fact that communist subversion and espionage in America, the kind that McCarthy railed about and called hearings about and badgered witnesses about and gave ranting press conferences about, actually existed in the United States during the early Cold War years. It existed throughout the Cold War and was a serious problem in American life during that time. McCarthy was wrong on the specifics. Few of his investigative targets were true threats to our national security, but he was correct that there were spies and subversives in our midst, and that some, for example, Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official who almost certainly was a Soviet spy, and Julius Rosenberg, a member of a Soviet-sponsored atomic spy ring in the United States, they were the most notable, but they were not the only ones. Some intended to do, and indeed did do, significant damage to this country. And one did not have to be a McCarthyite or even a conservative to know this. Plenty of American liberals during the 1950s, including Hubert Humphrey, the great liberal senator from Minnesota and future vice president, and Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, who was closer to socialism in his own politics, even than to liberalism, and who fought a long and bitter battle to prevent communists from taking over his union. And even Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leader and lifelong socialist, about whom I've written a biography, they understood this as well. So to use McCarthy and McCarthyism to avoid coming to grips with the legitimate dangers posed by communism in both its internal and external manifestations to American freedom and democracy, as some at the time attempted to do, and as some writing after the fact have attempted to do, is, well, obviously not on a par with the excesses of McCarthyism itself, wrong, and I would argue reprehensible. Tell the truth. That is the task of a historian, and indeed, it is a duty that all of us have. And if we tell the truth, we cannot avoid the fact that there was a danger in America in Joe McCarthy's time from Soviet-sponsored subversion. McCarthy and McCarthyism doesn't absolve us of the duty to tell the truth. Now, the other complication in Joe McCarthy's story, and the one I'll be spending a good portion of my time with you today discussing, is one that is filled with irony. And I'm always telling my students here at Lawrence University that if you want to understand history, you must understand and appreciate irony. And here is the irony in McCarthy's story. Up until the time he was elected to the Senate from Wisconsin in 1946, McCarthy's was the classic American success story, the one that we all love and relate to and are inspired by, the one that we live by as Americans, that anyone in this country, no matter how poor or marginalized or disadvantaged, if they work hard enough and dream big enough, can become that success story, that only an American story that keeps us burning the midnight oil when most of the rest of the world has gone to sleep. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, of course, but it happens often enough to become an integral part, perhaps the integral part of American culture. And Joe McCarthy's life embodied that American success story. And his early life, his Appleton life, his pre-senatorial life, the life before he became Joe McCarthy, is what I'd like to spend some time with now. On the surface, that life sounds like an early 20th century version of all people, Abraham Lincoln's. Consider, Joe McCarthy is born on a farm just outside of Appleton in 1908 to poorly educated parents, as Lincoln was almost exactly a century earlier. Like Lincoln, McCarthy has no pedigree, no money, no name. McCarthy leaves school, and again, like Lincoln, tries his hand at a variety of marginal occupations: chicken farmer, grocery store clerk. Lincoln was a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois for a time, before McCarthy goes back to high school at the age of 20, graduating in 1 year. McCarthy moves on to Marquette University, living hand to mouth, working as a janitor and a short order cook. The young Lincoln worked as a surveyor and a postmaster to earn extra cash, graduating in 1935 with a law degree at almost the same age as Lincoln was when he became a lawyer. McCarthy then hangs up his shingle and begins practicing law with no contacts, no connections, and initially no clients. But again, like Lincoln, he perseveres, winning friends and allies with the force of his personality. Like Lincoln, people are drawn to McCarthy, who is humorous, generous, and charismatic. He is clearly a young man on the rise. And what was once said of Lincoln, that his ambition was a little engine that knew no rest, is also true of Joe McCarthy. He runs repeatedly for political office, as Lincoln did, with, again, paralleling our future 16th president, varying degrees of success. We forget how many elections Lincoln lost before he won the one that counted the most, which we remember him most for. McCarthy runs for district attorney, for circuit judge, for the US Senate, until he finally wins. In classic American success story fashion, McCarthy simply outworks his rivals. What Lincoln himself once said, "I will work, and when my time comes, I will be ready," also applies to Joe McCarthy. Holding marathon court sessions as a judge here in Appleton to clear up clogged case dockets, just as Lincoln spent weeks riding circuit and trying cases in rural Illinois. driving thousands of miles through the night across Wisconsin during his Senate campaigns, sometimes reciting rosaries in his car to stay awake, replicating Lincoln's travels through his own state for the famous debates with Stephen Douglas during his own Senate campaign in 1858, sending out bushelfuls of pamphlets and flyers to potential voters in the days before direct mail technology made this easy, and meeting voters face to face everywhere in Wisconsin in the kind of retail politics that Lincoln also excelled at. McCarthy was famous for never forgetting a name. Joe McCarthy did all these things and more. Also, like Lincoln, political opponents underestimated McCarthy at their peril. As a virtual unknown running for circuit judge in Appleton in 1939, McCarthy was given no chance to unseat a long-serving, respected, older judge who paid little attention to the young upstart. He made a big mistake. McCarthy campaigned inexhaustibly, scouring the area, going door to door, meeting almost every voter in person. He also campaigned with bare knuckles, a McCarthy trademark, exaggerating his opponent's age. He claimed the judge was 73 when he was in fact 66, charging that the judge had gotten rich on the job. State court trial judges rarely get rich, at least in Wisconsin. Illinois and New York, you can speak for yourselves. Dictating personal phone postcards to voters and sending them out at a rate of 35 per day, and using an army of volunteer canvassers whose personal loyalty he inspired. The old judge, well, maybe not as old as McCarthy made him out to be, but old enough, was soon out of a job, a victim of taking Joe McCarthy too lightly. 7 years later, in 1946, another more well-known Wisconsin politician made the same mistake and suffered the same fate. Robert La Follette Jr., a member of the first family of Wisconsin politics, the son of Robert La Follette, America's first progressive, and a nationally prominent US senator in his own right, left the Progressive Party and ran for re-election in 1946 as a Republican, assuming his primary opponent, an obscure circuit judge from Appleton named Joe McCarthy, with no national experience, no statewide profile, and no famous father, would be easy pickings along his road to a fourth full term. La Follette barely campaigned, remaining in Washington during the primary run-up, doing high-profile legislative work, what we would today call inside the Beltway. Who was Joe McCarthy anyway? Again, big mistake. McCarthy crisscrossed Wisconsin, doing statewide what he had done in his judicial election, giving hundreds of speeches, perfecting the art of personal, grassroots campaigning. If you ever get sick of the cards constantly appearing in your mailboxes during campaign season, blame Joe McCarthy, because he really pioneered direct mail advertising, sending out thousands of pamphlets, long on photographs and short on ideology. Send them a picture and they'll never read, McCarthy told an associate, which emphasized his personality, his background, and his World War II service. La Follette had been too old to serve and was also known as an isolationist. In his interaction with voters, McCarthy sold himself as everything that the aloof patrician La Follette was not, a self-made man. McCarthy's mother had once told him, "Go out and be somebody, take a chance. Nobody starves in America." A working class man. McCarthy worked in a grocery store, was an elevator operator, and washed dishes to make ends meet. A small town man, and compared with Madison, La Follette's home, Appleton was certainly a small town. In other words, an average man, the kind of man an average voter could relate to. One of Us. That was the title of a biography written by the journalist Tom Wicker about Richard Nixon, and I think it also applies to Joe McCarthy. Voters want to see themselves, or at least what they consider to be the best versions of themselves in their candidates. Joe McCarthy sensed this and made sure every voter he met understood that they were in the presence of someone who was one of us. And as he had done 7 years earlier during his judgeship race, McCarthy made his opponent rue the day that he took him lightly and rue his sharp-elbowed campaign tactics. McCarthy attacked La Follette as a war profiteer and capitalized on La Follette's isolationism in the wake of what had, of course, become a very popular war, World War II, publicizing himself as Tail Gunner Joe, an exaggeration of his wartime air exploits, the very mention of which painted a vivid contrast with La Follette, who had sat out both world wars. McCarthy retained his judgeship during the campaign, which was illegal, but which gave him the continued imprimatur of judicial gravitas. McCarthy even forced another possible competitor out of the primary race by threatening to make an issue of his divorce, which was certainly what we would today call a hot button issue in 1946. McCarthy did not miss campaign appearances no matter what. On one trip across Wisconsin, he suffered 4 blowouts on 2 planes and traveled a total of 12 hours, but made it in to give his speech. And on primary day, it all paid off, barely. McCarthy defeated La Follette by 5,000 votes out of some 410,000 cast. McCarthy went on to beat his Democratic opponent handily in the general election and complete a rise to national office that could only be termed astonishing in its rapidity and drama. Again, the comparisons to Lincoln are apt. In 1854, Lincoln was out of elective politics, practicing law, successfully and lucratively to be sure, but there were, of course, plenty of lawyers with good clients and good incomes in the America of 1854. And although this is difficult for us to believe today, Lincoln was relatively obscure. 7 years later, in 1861, he was inaugurated the 16th president of the United States. 7 years after becoming a trial court judge, and there were plenty of them all over the state of Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy was elected to the United States Senate, knocking off a nationally known incumbent to do so. And in yet another parallel, when Lincoln defeated Stephen Douglas for the presidency in 1860, Douglas was not only more well-known than Lincoln, Douglas was probably one of the 5 most well-known individuals, not just politicians, in the United States at the time. And so, if our story ends there, on primary night, 1946, as Joe McCarthy, perhaps a little shocked himself, accepts the accolades of his supporters and friends and receives an even more shocked Robert La Follette Jr.'s concession telegram. It was only 1 word long. Congratulations. It would be a great story, one that affirms the qualities that we ourselves celebrate about our country. One of the ways in which many of us argue that it is an exceptional country, that America's class walls, its barriers to success, are more permeable than perhaps any other country in the world, that no one is fixed in position, and that fortunes can be made, positions achieved, power amassed, and successes attained, all in the course of a generation. Lincoln himself believed deeply in this idea, which he called the right to rise, and was called by others the free labor idea. Lincoln's belief in it explains why he hated slavery as he did, since it did fix men in positions from which they could not improve themselves by dint of hard work and application. The man who labored for another last year, Lincoln once said, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. That was American to Abraham Lincoln. That was its essence. And until 1946 and his election to the Senate, Joe McCarthy embodied it as well. In many respects, then, we wish that McCarthy's story ended in 1946, when there was a McCarthy, but not a McCarthyism. But of course, we know that it did not, and that it was in fact just beginning, and that it henceforth would bear no resemblance to Abraham Lincoln's. When S. Scott Fitzgerald wrote famously that there are no second acts in American life, he clearly got it wrong. There are second acts, and McCarthy's second act as a senator on the national stage of the early 1950s was a Greek tragedy. filled with fatal pride, personal flaws, and a rapid descent from glory that also became an ongoing American tragedy. Let me use the remainder of my time with you today to talk about how this came to pass. Joe McCarthy became a national figure and a national symbol on February 9th, 1950, when, in a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he charged that the United States Department of State, presided over by Secretary of State Dean Acheson and supervised, of course, by President Harry Truman, had permitted a number of employees who were known to be security risks, either subversives or out-and-out communists, to keep their jobs at this most sensitive government agency. The Truman administration, McCarthy charged, was soft on communism. Now, to understand how serious a charge this was, we need to understand the political atmosphere in the United States in 1950. By that year, America's Cold War with the Soviet Union specifically, and with communist ideology generally, had come to dominate the nation's politics, its culture, and to a large degree, the everyday lives of its citizens. During the years following the end of World War II, the USSR had pulled its Eastern European neighbors into its orbit, installing puppet regimes and totalitarian dictatorships there that would endure for most of the remainder of the 20th century. Germany itself had been divided, with Soviet-dominated East Germany encircling and threatening to invade the besieged western section of Berlin. In 1949, the year before McCarthy's Wheeling speech, the USSR had exploded an atomic bomb with the help, as it turned out, of an American spy ring that included Julius Rosenberg, who I mentioned earlier, and who would be executed in 1953 for conspiracy to commit espionage. Also in 1949, China was conquered by the communist and virulently anti-American regime of Mao Zedong. And in 1950 itself, shortly after McCarthy's Wheeling speech, the Korean War began, the result of the invasion of pro-American South Korea by the communist North, an invasion that metastasized into a bloody seesaw 3-year struggle that would claim 33,000 American lives and end in stalemate. And thus, to the average American hearing McCarthy's speech, or more likely reading about it the next day, it seemed that Marxism was everywhere on the march, and ominously everywhere victorious. There was a palpable mood in the nation that, in the words of ex-communist Whittaker Chambers, who had become a fierce critic of Marxism and who was the man who accused Alger Hiss, who I mentioned earlier as a likely Soviet spy, that in the existential battle between the forces of democracy and totalitarianism, of light and darkness, America, in Chambers' words, was on the losing side. It was in this atmosphere that Joe McCarthy made his charges in February 1950. Now, the exact number of subversives that he named that day has been lost to history. Some accounts say 205, others 57. But in a sense, the exact numbers did not matter. What did matter was that McCarthy, who in yet another Lincoln parallel was like Lincoln, a very astute politician, had been able to gauge the national mood and articulate it. McCarthy put his finger on what Americans were afraid of in 1950, and the result was his meteoric political rise. Within days of McCarthy's speech, his was a household name. Using his notoriety as a platform, he launched a series of investigations into communist subversion in various departments and agencies of the federal government. His style was blustery, and he often lacked control of his facts. And his attacks contained a sharp partisan edge. They were directed both against suspected communists in the government and those who, in McCarthy's view, had protected them. And that usually meant Democrats and liberals. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a Democrat, was his favorite target. And not just because McCarthy thought he was insufficiently enthusiastic about the anti-communist crusade. For McCarthy and his supporters, small-town Midwesterners from places like Appleton and blue-collar Catholics from the cities, middle and lower middle class to the core, the patrician Episcopalian Dean Acheson, with his Ivy League credentials and his impeccable Eastern establishment pedigree, represented everything that was wrong with America. Effete, snobbish, wavering moral relativists like Dean Acheson, McCarthy, and his supporters believed, were incapable of leading the kind of no-holds-barred fight that was necessary to defeat communism at home and abroad. Implicit in this belief were the resentments of the working and middle classes in America for their social betters, the elites. Acheson, after all, went to Harvard and Yale. Joe McCarthy, who didn't even graduate high school until he was 20, went to Marquette. Dean Acheson was the product of a Tony, high-class Washington law firm, while McCarthy struggled for clients in a corner of Wisconsin. For years, men like Dean Acheson had asked, indirectly, much of the time, but sometimes explicitly, whether people like Joe McCarthy and those who supported him were real Americans. If he had lived in 2016, McCarthy may well have called them deplorables. But through the vehicle of anti-communism, McCarthyites could turn the table. They were the true Americans now, standing up to the Soviet Union, while the Dean Achesons of the world cowered, afraid to confront treason, no better in the end than accomplices to it. McCarthy thus harnessed a populist impulse in American politics that has run through our history and plays a major role in our political culture today. Nobody loves Joe but the people. That was the title of McCarthy's anthem, and it epitomized his appeal. Joe McCarthy came from the people, loved the people, and spoke for the people. But there was a flaw to this, one that would ultimately make Joe McCarthy's story both a personal and a national tragedy. In his zeal to expose communism in government, McCarthy overreached, smearing the reputations of communists and non-communists alike with undiscriminating ferocity. McCarthy came to use the tactic of guilt by association with vicious cruelty. Non-communist liberals could be attacked and, in some cases, their careers destroyed because they happened to support some of the same causes as did communists. By 1954, McCarthy considered someone like that as bad as an actual communist. By this time, the term McCarthyism, with its connotation of witch hunts, thought control, and what we would today call political correctness, had become part of the American political lexicon. And it became the vehicle of McCarthy's personal downfall that year, when he charged perhaps the most powerful and, ironically, most conservative institution in American life, the United States Army, with harboring communist subversives. The resulting Army McCarthy hearings, which ran from April to June 1954 and reached millions through the medium of television, exposed little in the way of actual subversion, and instead exposed McCarthy himself as cruel, crude, reckless, and in the end, lacking decency. And that one single word, this last one, sealed the tragedy of Joe McCarthy and brought his career to an end. The word was not communist, subversive, or even American, but the simple word decency. Before the Army McCarthy hearings began, the Army's attorney, a Boston lawyer named Joseph Welch, agreed with McCarthy's staff that nothing be said publicly about a man who worked in Welch's law firm, who had some years earlier briefly belonged to an organization with communist ties. The lawyer had resigned when he learned of those ties. Welch requested, and McCarthy agreed, that this not be made public for fear of needlessly ruining the man's career. But late in the hearings themselves, during a heated moment, McCarthy, in a fit of temper, revealed the young lawyer's former affiliation on national television. What the grandfatherly, courtly Welch said next may have changed American history. Welch recounted the story of their now broken agreement, and then, when McCarthy tried to interrupt him, stopped him in his tracks. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" At long last, Welch said. "Have you left no sense of decency?" Welch's words were the beginning of the end for Joe McCarthy, the first step in his rapid descent into personal tragedy. Appalled by his behavior, the American public, while remaining anti-communist, turned against him. Later, in 1954, his colleagues began to shun him as the Senate voted overwhelmingly to condemn him for conduct unbecoming his office. The media, which once hung on McCarthy's words, now ignored him. Disgraced and isolated, McCarthy descended into alcoholism and despair. Just before he died of liver failure in May 1957, at the age of 48, he told a friend, "I've lived a million years." McCarthy now spends eternity in Appleton, the place he knew and loved best, and the place that, at least for a time, nourished and burnished his American dreams. But while McCarthy was dead, McCarthyism, as I explained at the beginning of my talk, lived on. Henceforth, there would be McCarthyism of both the left and the right in America. Apologists for Marxism during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and on into the 21st century would use McCarthy's disgraced name to inhibit criticisms of totalitarian regimes in China, Cuba, Vietnam, and until it fell, the Soviet Union itself. Those who dared criticize those regimes, even if they proceeded from the best of motives, the hope that their people enjoy freedom, were often smeared by many segments of the Democratic Party, as well as in the media and academia, as practitioners of McCarthyism. The Republican Party and the American right in general had McCarthyism problems of its own during this time. For example, confusing honest criticism of the war in Vietnam with pro-communist treason. It was of a piece and remains so, even more so today. The political correctness, modern day McCarthyism, that now manifests itself in virtually every aspect of American life, had its origin with the junior senator from Wisconsin. McCarthy did tremendous harm to American politics and culture. His legacy is a cheapened American conversation with innuendo and half-truths or outright falsehoods, substituted for rational debate, with misplaced phrases, even a single wrong-headed word capable of ruining reputations and careers and lives, and a singularly ungenerous society lacking empathy and that most important of attributes, decency. Joe McCarthy didn't have it then, and because he didn't, we do not have it today. And people, liberals and conservatives and independents, are afraid. The numbers do not lie. In the 1950s, at the height of McCarthyism, 13% of Americans, when polled, admitted that they felt less free to speak their minds than they used to. In 1987, that percentage has risen to 20%. In 2019, it was 40%. And a survey taken last year revealed that 62% of the American public, 42% of liberals and 77% of conservatives, conceal their political views, meaning that almost 2/3 of all Americans self-censor. So it is an American tragedy that the second part of Joe McCarthy's life, the post-1946 part, did not resemble the first, the part that took place in and around Appleton, and that resembled Lincoln's. The qualities that McCarthy took out of Appleton, work, imagination, education, determination, friendship, faith, allowed him to realize the American dream before he was 40. But he did not carry those qualities with him to Washington. And it is his tragedy and ours that he did not. McCarthy has left us a diminished nation, and perhaps, and this is even worse, two diminished nations, separate and seemingly irreconcilable. In March 1861, speaking directly to his Southern countrymen in his inaugural address, begging them to remain in this nation, Abraham Lincoln said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." The better angels of our nature. Have better words ever been uttered by an American? Have better words ever expressed what it means to be an American? America is, at its essence, about three things: freedom, equality, and the better angels of our nature. Joseph McCarthy's legacy is an America that ignores its better angels. Abraham Lincoln's is the challenge to recover them. May we again be touched by our better angels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. We actually have a lot of comments in the chat, so I'm going to read some of them to you, and then we'll start asking some of the questions that are in the chat as well. The first comment is from Jeff Reister. "We raised our kids in a house along the river in Appleton, previously owned by Joe Garvey, who was a pal of Joe McCarthy. The two Joes, along with the Van Susteren brothers, one of whom was Greta Van Susteren's dad, used to play poker in the basement of that house. I swear we could smell this odor of cigars from the basement family room."
That's a great story. I knew about Urban Van Susteren being Joe McCarthy's probably best friend, and I think godfather to Greta Van Susteren. I can only imagine what the cigar smoke smells like.